Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It has been a minute. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. And we answer your questions about work here. And I'm here with Lia Kennett, who I've had the pleasure of working with. Even before I knew I worked with you, which is to say Lia runs Kennett Productions, which produces the events, many of the events in tech that are the most prestigious, but as we were just talking earlier, sort of like an if you know, like if you know what I do, you know what I do. And we've worked together on the event that Bloomberg Beta hosts, which is called Going to Work, which is an unconference about work in America. And then, lots of others, the Lobby, which I think was the first time maybe that I became aware of your work. And one of the things that we'd been talking about, Lia, is this thing that happens sometimes in my line of work, but happens more often, I think, in anything that does producing things in the real world, which is you enter into an agreement with somebody, they're supposed to deliver something, and then they fail to honor their agreement, sometimes through incompetence, sometimes through a change of heart, sometimes through outright deception, and who knows. And so I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you for being here. I would just love to hear your thoughts, like the practical wisdom on when that comes up for you. How do you handle it when somebody fails to honor an agreement?
First of all, it's just a hard conversation right out of the gate, right? So I always try to go into every relationship like that as a true partnership. So I know that I have a role in that. It's two-way street. So it's a conversation about expectations. Sometimes, as you noted, there's deception on the part of one party or the other. And then hopefully not my part. Or scope creep or things happen, life gets in the way. So I like to start with a conversation around what's going on, making sure that we have clear expectations and a clear understanding of those expectations. So that starts the process, right? And so those things are sometimes really hard to do. But if I'm not getting satisfactory, I go up the food chain. And in the background, I usually try to problem solve on the back end to see what I need to do in parallel, right? So solve the problem with the person in front of me, see if I can find another resource to make it happen.
Okay, so but let's I mean, we don't have to name names and do an example,
Yeah.
but what's the kind of thing where this might go wrong and you might need to do this?
Any number of things, right? I use contractors all the time to expand my team. So sometimes that happens. Working with a client, sometimes that happens where, you go into something with one point of view, thinking you have clear understanding of what expectations are, and they're not delivering, or they feel I'm not delivering. That actually has happened before as well. So really getting to the place where we understand clearly what the goals are and expectations. And then we can figure out if there's a way forward, and you try to talk through all of those details, or if it's time to part ways and you find somebody else. So a good example, I think probably more specifically related to the kind of work that I do, is sometimes when you hire a venue and you have an expectation of the experience you're trying to deliver, and they don't follow through, or you're in the planning cycle. I mean,
You said that they would have green M&Ms on the table, and they do not have green M&Ms or brown M&Ms or whatever it is on the table.
Something like that. Very often it's not so small. Sometimes it's
but a bigger one.
sure
like this room would be ready at 6 p.m. and it was not ready at 6 p.m.
Or guest rooms are clean when people arrive,
right?
Or there isn't another group in the space that you contracted to me, or we're supposed to have menus turned around 2 weeks in advance and I'm not seeing them. So there's any number of those things that are kind of leading indicators that there's a failure here, and we start to manage that process, but also all of those little things. And so really understanding how can we, if it's a game day in the moment decision, it's like, how are we fixing this?
So in that case, these are things where they're failing to honor the agreement through performance, basically. They're failing to perform.
Typically.
And then you're making a judgment call, it sounds like, sort of, how bad does it have to get? How do you think about it before you pull the plug on working with them and try to work with somebody else? Or like, tell us about what escalation.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, so I'll share an example I'm in the middle of right now. There's a hotel that I've worked with a client in the past. We had a good experience, not a great experience, but the client loves this venue. and it's got all the right spaces, and it's got, the beachfront view, all the things that the, exterior look great. It's kind of a disaster on the back end. And there's always the thing, it's like the Disneyland experience. Like, look over there, it's a beautiful view, and we'll fix the problem over here. The attendee doesn't really need to know. Sometimes the client doesn't need to know. We had issues like there was a hole in somebody's guest room that was stuffed with Kleenex. There's a horrible thing like that, right? Or they had bugs in the ballroom and we needed to like spray. So like little things like that we had to deal with. And I would have never gone back on my own had they not remedied those things. The client wants to go back. So now I'm putting a contract in place that ensures that they are partnering with us to remedy any of those things that come up in pre-production. And then to your contract, a performance clause on the other side. So if they don't meet those obligations in advance, right, this is planning in advance, then we can get cancellation without penalty. Any monies paid will be returned to us, and we'll find another venue. So those things, you can put systems, processes, agreements in place in advance to try to mitigate some of that. And then, like you said, in the moment, if you have to deal with it real time, it really is kind of a harder conversation, because sometimes they don't have the resources available, or they just don't understand why we're not happy with something that we find,
And how
not up
about
to
the
snuff.
cases where they fail to honor an agreement, but it's not because of performance? It's they just made a choice that they didn't want to, or they're supposed to pay you back for something and they just cheated you. Oftentimes, I think, especially for folks who are dealing with those kind of agreements for the first time, it's astonishing when someone, I remember the first time I was in a meeting and somebody says, yeah, we have a contract, but who cares? I was like, wait, you can do that? Like, it didn't even occur to me that was a thing you can do.
Yeah.
And now I get it. And so how do you handle those situations where it's more like will and less like skill?
Yeah. Well, if you can, it's harder, obviously, right? You have to find common ground somewhere if it exists, right? So in some of those cases, then you walk away and you'll never do business with that person again. And I have a big mouth. I'll make sure nobody else I love or care for or work with will do business with that person again. So that does happen, and it has happened. I think in other cases, if there is common ground and there is hope that you might work together at some point, you could escalate the situation. If it's an organization versus an individual, escalate it, see if you can get management or somebody else on board, and then take it that way. But it does happen. It is unfortunate.
Yeah. I think that the question of what to do when there isn't an escalation path, when that is it, the person just welches, basically, is some of the hardest stuff. And, you named one thing, which is you have a consequence on them, which is their reputation. And often we struggle with that in venture because, two sides to every story. And, and so, there's also who you can name. I'll just say there's escalation there too, which is privately telling people I would never work with this firm again or something like that. We've had firms that have canceled signed term sheets, and a term sheet is technically legally non-binding, and the norms differ depending on the industry. So like in private equity, a non-binding term sheet often doesn't go through, but in venture, it almost always does. That's just the norm. And, and oftentimes we'll have a handshake with somebody, and they will, like, a written handshake is a thing in VC, and they'll just not agree to it. And, what I've found is that it's so tempting to think that you can wheedle, cajole, yell, and that stuff just doesn't work.
You just cut and run. So like at the end of the day, sometimes it's all you can do.
And then remember, because that will come up again. And the reality is, I think you can get through life breaking agreements left and right and not necessarily have consequences for it. And it's just a question of what kind of person you want to be, because like, what kind of a business do you want to run? And one of the things I like about Bloomberg is it feels like a very dependable place in terms of its agreements. And by the way, on Wall Street, I think a lot of things get done through informal agreement that ends up having to bind. Last thing I'd just say is, and I'm curious in your line of work how you think about this, is it's very different when it's a repeated game versus a one-time game. So if I see another VC firm and they break an agreement, I'm probably going to see them around for years to come. And so we will all relate to each other,
Yeah.
understanding that's a repeated game. Whereas if I'm hosting a conference in some city I've never been to before, only one thing, it doesn't work out, I really don't like that vendor, and then I leave, maybe there's no consequence to them because I don't, I can't badmouth them to their future clients or whatever it is.
Yes.
And so I'm curious how you think about it, whether it's a one-time thing or a repeated thing, and how much does that matter?
Yeah. I mean, I think you make the call. Do you want to risk it? Right. It is a
Yeah,
risk, right? And at the end of the day, you have to have, if you can't get over the hump and get some agreement, then you have to make that call, whether it's me making the call, trying to convince my client one way or the other, or finding a solution. And so I think that instinct has a lot to do with it. I'm old, so I have like built up sort of good guts about this kind of stuff
me
typically. So
too.
thankfully it doesn't happen that often. But you have to be able to just be able to say, I'm going to cut and run. I'm not doing this anymore. Or I'll give us another try. And sometimes it works out, like they rise to the occasion. You get over that miscommunication or misunderstanding, whatever it is. And it's funny. I've had clients that kind of think about scorched earth, right? They'll just do the agreement, they'll walk away, or they just don't think about it, right? And I don't operate that way, right? So I will try to bridge that gap. I don't want to do business that way. I've fired clients for that kind of behavior because I don't want my reputation tarnished in that way.
Totally.
And it just doesn't feel good to work that way, right? We love what we do, put a lot into it. It doesn't feel good to work like that.
Well, I think you raised another excellent point in that, which is oftentimes there's an escalation path on your own side of like, okay, then this happens on our team all the time. It's like if somebody breaks an agreement, I don't decide, well, I might depending on the moment, but I choose whether to decide single-handedly or to bring it to the team and say, look, how we handle this affects all of our reputations, or I just like your advice on this, or I need you to do something about this, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And so there's sort of a constellation of parties on both sides. You can escalate on their side, you can escalate on your own side. And I think there's this period of muttering to each other that happens while you're figuring out what to do. And then once you make a choice, understanding the consequences of it. And look, different entities operate in different ways. And like I said, two sides to every story. It is very rare. It has happened to me, but it is very rare that somebody will come to me and be like, I had a deal with you and I broke it.
Mm-hmm.
People will do it. They'll sometimes use other words, and the language matters a lot. Like if you say to somebody, you welched, you reneged, sometimes that can be even just accusing them of that can break the entire relationship, and sometimes not.
Yeah.
And so, just being aware of the norms and knowing how to operate on them, I think seems very important too.
It's true.
Any parting thoughts?
No, I think you're right. I think, parting thoughts. We covered all the bases, right? And I think people make those decisions. I don't know. It goes all ways.
It's very tempting to make it an
moment.
absolutist thing of like,
it's true.
They fail to honor the agreement, we're done. And in the reality,
well said. Yes.
Reality is not like that. We all, and it's part of why trust gets built gradually. And so I think just seeing these shades of gray is really powerful.
Well said. Yes, I agree. Holistically.
Yay. All right. Super. Well, if folks have other questions, what we do is often take the questions that we've heard, and folks can reach out. You can find, you will be able to find this one soon, but you can find other questions we've asked in the past and others at thisisnotadvice.work. And Lia, I'm looking forward to our next event that we're working on together. We're already in the works.
Me too. Always.
All right. Thank you.
This was fun.
To be continued. Bye. So fun.